So today's topic will be on security of mega events. I'm particularly interested in the transnational private actors that are influencing security in our territories when they were not voted by us. And we want to look at how that impacts on governance, who is governing and how that affects people who are excluded from the governance terrain. We can all agree by the recent attacks by ISIS, formerly Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups that the global world is now multifaceted and it has plural actors, both state and non-state. Scholars of legal pluralism and other areas, like global governance, reject the idea that the state is the only actor that is relevant on the stage of law. So increasingly, there is more talk about governance than government. And by governance, we look at any actor that is able to shape a particular field, whether for good or for bad. For example, in the case of ISIS, you could say it's a bad actor. But for those who actually believe in its message, they have a legitimate cause. And that is not to say I advocate for ISIS, but just to give you an example of the different actors that are challenging conventional understanding of state governance and security. So I talk about nodal governance in the sense that I look at governance as filled with both state and non-state. And nodal governance does not necessarily, it doesn't prioritize the state as the main actor. It looks at sites of power. And for me, my basic interest is in the transnational private actors. And I use mega events to understand how different actors at the global, national, regional, and local levels interact with each other to shape events in those spaces. Mega events are defined by Roche as large-scale cultural events which have a dramatic character, mass popular appeal, and international significance. Mega events can include political events such as the G20 summits, but I'm particularly interested in the sports mega events because these are mainly under-researched. Mega events require special policing because they attract different types of threats. For example, for the 2018 World Cup that is coming up next year, we can assume that ISIS and other actors are interested in using that event to shape their own messages. If we look at how the recent concert at those who are familiar with Ariana Grande, not necessarily her music, but you must have heard that her concert was recently attacked by different actors. And so we see that these events are not just interesting to those who seek to benefit from them, like states or the sports governing bodies, but also these terrorists who want to use those events to send a particular message. And they also are of interest to people who engage in ambush marketing. For those who don't know what ambush marketing is, this is the illegal association of a product with a particular event when you have not paid for the product, for the sponsorship. For example, if Coca-Cola pays to associate its brand with Olympic Games and Pepsi-Cola tries to give people t-shirts to wear, that is what they call ambush marketing. They try to benefit without necessarily paying anything. So as we can see, these events are of interest to both local and global actors. But the question is, why are these actors interested in these events and what do they seek to gain? For FIFA, it claims that it wants to touch the world, improve soccer, and unite humanity. The corporate sponsors like Adidas, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Anheuser-Busch, they want to expand their global brands to different territories. And the host country usually use the excuse of nation building, but mainly it's also about improving their infrastructure. They also assume that these events will bring a lot of money because everyone will be watching these events and hopefully come and tour these cities. And the host cities that host these events also want to compete on the world stage. And as I said before, we have terrorist groups. For those who are not aware, the Munich Olympics were disrupted in 1972 by Palestinians who murdered some of the teammates, and they claimed that for them that event was very successful. It was successful to them because before nobody knew about them. But now, as they said, everyone is saying Black September, Black September. Who is Black September? To us, it's as if we painted the name of Palestine around the world, and can be seen from any corner of the world. So for today, I will focus particularly on FIFA because that is what my fieldwork was on. But what exactly is FIFA? What is its legal status? According to the Article 60 of the Swiss Civil Code, FIFA is an association registered in the Commercial Register in accordance with this regulation, and that gives it non-profit organization status. So FIFA is a non-profit organization that boasts of 211 member states. It has more states than the United Nations, which has 193 states. The World Trade Organization has only 148, and so it has earned itself the United Nations of football. FIFA influences laws for securing the FIFA World Cup, but the question is, how does a non-state actor with no legitimacy to give authority implement and enforce laws inside a foreign state? Where does FIFA get its legitimacy in a world that conceptualizes states as the main relevant actors? When I think of FIFA, this is what I think of it. As an alien that exists outside the state, because according to conventional international law, states are the main actors. However, here we have this alien coming in a ship, and then it lands in the host countries, and then everything changes. So today we'll look at how does this change. So here we have the map of Cape Town, and those little boxes are the host cities that hosted the World Cup. So what we will look at is what happened when FIFA came into these spaces. So South Africa is just the example I give. However, you should understand that what happens here is similar to what happened everywhere that FIFA hosts the World Cup. So to understand mega events, you have to understand that they function in a global capitalistic world where these events are commercialized, they are informed by neoliberal agenda, and security is mainly about protecting interests of sponsors rather than necessarily terrorism. States seek to attract investors through showing off world-class cities and state-of-the-art infrastructure. And they do this because they are hoping that after this, investors will come and end up settling there. And transnational corporations, as I already mentioned, seek to use these new spaces to associate their brands in those areas. So to understand how FIFA governs, we have to understand that countries sign particular agreements before they can host the World Cup. So at the bidding stage, there are certain guarantees that countries give to FIFA, and these are in the bidding agreement, which once you sign is a legally binding document, and you cannot come out of this agreement. So in order to fulfill these guarantees, states must amend existing laws if they do not accommodate FIFA's requirements. Examples of the guarantees that were given to FIFA during the World Cup, and which will also happen during the 2018 World Cup and 2022 World Cup in Qatar, and next year in Russia, are tax exemptions, indemnification from lawsuits brought against FIFA, whether directly or indirectly, and the FIFA World Cup must be given protected event status, which means that the countries must ensure and do everything within their power to ensure that nobody benefits commercially without paying FIFA. And so these particular agreements are standard agreements that every country signs. For the 2022 World Cup and 2018 World Cup, it's one particular document, but when I examined it, it was similar to what the 2010 FIFA World Cup, how the 2010 FIFA World Cup was governed. And what that means is that for Qatar in 2022, even if it's ruled by Sharia, for that particular point of the World Cup, they will have to suspend some of the Sharia laws to enable the laws of FIFA to prevail. For example, if Anheuser-Busch is already a sponsor of the World Cup, they must sell Budweiser in those spaces. So without going ahead of myself, I can almost guarantee that the biggest threat, security threat at least to Qatar, will be probably from other Muslim countries who may look at Qatar as selling out by suspending Sharia law. And of course, right now, nobody's talking about it because these documents are private. Of course, they should be public because the events that, the money that is used to govern them is public funds, but there's a confidentiality clause that does not allow these clauses to be discussed in public. So we will look at the legal and institutional architecture that allows FIFA to govern inside states. There are national laws that exist within different countries, and these, as I said before, these laws must adhere to FIFA's laws, or they must be suspended, or the government must pass new laws. And so there are always national laws, the host city laws, special measures acts, those are the ones that govern particular spaces where FIFA is hosting the event. International laws have to be enforced alongside regional and global agencies, and international best practice of securing sports events must be used, which means that, for example, international best practice, South Africa had to be trained by Germany on how to police the World Cup. Brazil came to South Africa to watch how that was done, and Russia also went to Brazil. So you can see that these are standard agreements that move from one particular space to another. So there's some sort of legal transplantation of private laws that move from one particular event to another. So these laws are enforced under the co-supervision or monitoring of FIFA and its representatives. And when I say enforced and co-supervised, I mean that literally. FIFA will attend most of the meetings. As one particular interviewer said, first they come to inspect, then slowly and slowly their presence is increasingly seen. Before you know it, they've taken over and they're planning everything. And he said that when they came to Germany for the World Cup, they noticed that, for the preparation of the World Cup, they noticed that FIFA had taken over. And he mentioned that at some point you couldn't tell who were the government officials and who was FIFA. And for South Africa, he mentioned that when we would hear that FIFA is coming, we would panic. Everybody would panic. FIFA is here, FIFA is here, because they now have moved in. So when you think about that in terms of conventional international law, I find that very interesting, that this is a state person, because this was a policeman I was talking to, talking about how the government was afraid of FIFA, because they would have to give presentations to FIFA to explain where they were in the implementation process. So the effect of these laws is that they specialize, first of all, they are spatially oriented in the sense that they target particular spaces. That is a 1.5 mile radius within the stadium or anywhere that the FIFA sponsors are. And that, so these spaces, the creation of these spaces brings about simultaneous spaces, meaning the laws that are governed here do not govern, for example, Max Planck, which is interesting because the laws that govern those spaces are particular FIFA laws. So in those spaces, FIFA prescribes what is accepted and what is prohibited in those areas. And the effect of this is the privatization of public spaces. And this is interesting because then you see the state enforcing private rules. And for my research, I looked at the FIFA Fun Walk, and that was a 1 kilometer walk from the city towards the Central Cape Town Stadium and the different stadiums in Cape Town where the World Cup took place, and the fun parks. So this area is very interesting. This is one of the most affluent areas in Cape Town. It's called Green Point. You can see over there, that is Table Mountain, and that cloud over there, although not very important for this presentation, is the tablecloth, as we call it. So any space around there. So that area is mainly residential areas. And the sky buildings, the high sky rises are part of some of them are business buildings which had names of, like for example, names of businesses. And FIFA had demanded that they should cover those names because otherwise they would benefit without paying for the World Cup. But what is interesting about this stadium is that the city had no money for it. In fact, it was not even in the budget. But FIFA insisted, after having seen another stadium in a different area, insisted that they should build this stadium because it showcases Cape Town in a great light. Now, when you think of South Africa, a country that is plagued by inequality, and also the fact that football during apartheid was predominantly a black people's game, and now you have a stadium in a very white area where it is not wanted, where it is not doing any improvement, that was very problematic. But the reason they had to do this is because when you sign FIFA's agreements, FIFA's agreements, the clauses are very broad. One of the clauses it has is that FIFA reserves the right to include any other provision at a later stage, and that you are deemed to have agreed to that provision. So, because of this, the city of Cape Town was very surprised that they now had to come up with money to build this stadium. And of course, this is at your own cost. And that was very problematic because later, after talking to one policeman, I wanted to understand, since the World Cup was very safe, why is it that they're unable to secure the country in the way they secured the FIFA World Cup? And his answer was, we don't have the political will. I say we are not serious. And he explained that how do you rationalize spending 6 billion on a stadium when you refuse to spend 300 million on security? So it shows you the amount of money that goes into these stadiums and how the government is less reluctant to spend it on everyday safety. So this is an example of the FIFA Fun Park. This is where mainly people who could not afford to watch the World Cup went. And these are very fun spaces, but for example, for South Africa, majority of the people couldn't afford the tickets. And so there were spaces that were used to showcase the game. And as you can see from far left, you'll see Coca-Cola. And these spaces also are spaces of commercialization, where again, products are sold that belong to these commercial affiliates. What is very interesting is that many of them could not afford to eat the food there, the South Africans. And of course, you cannot enter with food. And when I asked one of them, do you feel safe in this space? If so, what makes you feel safe? And her answer was, I don't feel safe. And I was so surprised because of course it looked safe, there's security everywhere. And he said, can you imagine they won't let us bring in our food and yet we can't afford to eat McDonald's or drink Coca-Cola. So then, how do you understand this, how would you describe these spaces? So these spaces then become representative of places where the global elite can have fun. Even though the spaces are, even though the World Cup is sold to the public as a national event that will improve nation building, and it was sold as a South African World Cup, an African World Cup, it's Africa's time, but most of the people there could not afford the things. So what is interesting is, I mean, this is the police outside the Greenpoint Stadium, but what is interesting about this picture is that most of the security was also for show. As we found out later, the private security workers that were supposed to police the event went on strike. But because they went on strike because the money was so little, and these are actually police students, they are not qualified policemen. So they were given uniforms to wear so that they could give the facade of a secure World Cup. So what exactly is being enforced in these spaces? As we can see from that picture, some of the security, I mean, even though it was good, was not necessarily performed by trained people. The FIFA bylaws on intellectual property are being enforced in there, and commercial crimes, which include the abuse of FIFA's intellectual property and the abuse of the commercial sponsors, e.g. ambush marketing and counterfeit products, is not allowed in those spaces. But what is interesting about the policing of those spaces is that FIFA does not let the policing be done by just the state. FIFA representatives are also part of the policing team. They will actually have a representative, also some law students, at least in the World Cup in Cape Town, they hired some law students who acted as volunteers who would be able to spot any violation of the laws. And the FIFA representatives on those policing teams had a direct number to FIFA lawyers. So if they saw something that was infringing on their rights, it was dealt with there and then. There were 24-hour courts to process World Cup related crime. So one argument is that it improved justice, but justice for who? And also, one of the things that is not allowed is protests, and of course they have people banned from, any non-hooligan is banned, and FIFA laws are not just enforced at the transnational level. They are also, I mean, at the local level within those spaces. That's just a small part of the picture. There are bilateral agreements within states in the EU. For example, for the German World Cup, there were preventative arrests, there were preventative detentions. If your name appeared on one of the lists as someone who has been engaged in hooliganism, your passport was either confiscated or you were detained. Now please understand that this is not because you have committed a crime, because the crime was done in the past. This is because they fear that you might commit a crime. So policing these events is informed by the risk society, where you eliminate the risk before it actually happens. And so for the 2010 World Cup, the UK shared a list with South Africa of non-hooligans whose passports were taken away, and those who managed somehow to go to escape through and go to Zimbabwe were caught at the border, which means the policing is very thorough. When they wanted to go through the Zimbabwean border, but Interpol was already ready for them. So what is interesting here is that the policing of hooligans during mega events becomes as serious as the policing of terrorists. But remember, this is just a game. For the French World Cup in 1998, some Algerian fans were deported, and this is not because they had committed a crime, it's because the policemen felt that they typically fit the look of people who could potentially commit a crime. So that got very negative press for the French. And as early as 2004, someone had registered the domain name related to 2010 World Cup, and FIFA reported this to the World Intellectual Property Organization. So it shows you how thorough they are. And the reason why they reported at the World Intellectual Property Organization, because that was 2004. The World Cup would only come in effect in 2010. So what do? They cannot go to South Africa because the laws don't exist yet. The laws were only enacted in 2006. So what's the next best thing? International laws. So at the local level enforcement, FIFA insists that state police should collaborate at the local, provincial, and national level. And an example of how intellectual property rights were policed, there is a local airline called Kulula. And because FIFA had registered 500 trademarks prohibiting the use of 2010 World Cup, FIFA World Cup, or anything, Kulula Airline got smart, and it used the advert on television saying, "We are the unofficial sponsors of the you-know-what." But everyone knew exactly what they were talking about. And this is an example. So they had the vuvuzela. I don't know if you know what the vuvuzela is, but that's the long trumpet that people were using to blow, to cheer for the World Cup. So they had that and soccer balls. So in essence, they had not violated the laws because they used it very smartly, you know. They must have had good lawyers. But because they kept on saying the unofficial sponsors of the you-know-what, people understood that they meant the World Cup, and everyone was talking about it. And that's the whole point of ambush marketing. You don't want to pay, but you want to benefit. And it's not like most of these sponsors don't want to pay. It's that FIFA does not give them a chance to pay, because already Emirates is always the national sponsor, you know. And that's why a lot of corruption is said to take place, because people bribe. They pay, I don't know whether, allegedly, people bribe to host these, to become the national sponsors. We don't know whether that is for a fact, but we know that Sepp Blatter is no longer president. There must be some reason he isn't. So for the World Cup, there's this Bavarian company, and they do this all the time. In 2006, they did this, where they tried to capitalize on the event. So in 2006 World Cup, they gave lederhosen to German fans with their company logo, and they weren't allowed in the stadium. The fans ended up watching their game in their underpants. For the World Cup 2010, this was in Johannesburg. They gave very short mini dresses to blonde girls. So who moved in a group, and they were spotted. And even though you couldn't see the brand, everyone knew it was Bavaria. So they were arrested, some were deported, and they were threatened with a criminal offense and with jail time because of the 24-hour courts. However, this backfired, because people looked at FIFA as a bully. Even though in essence it has the intellectual property to these events, they look at it as a bully, and Bavaria became the hero, sort of like the David fighting Goliath, you know. And again, this is an example of a successful campaign of ambush marketing. So FIFA laws are usually very broad, and they have very strict enforcement, as I gave the example of Kulula. They were prohibited from doing any ad that depicts the Cape Town Stadium, the soccer balls, the World South Africa, the national flag, any reference to the World Cup, and any use of the vuvuzela. Even though the vuvuzela is a South African instrument and had not actually been trademarked, because I mean FIFA cannot own the patent to a local instrument. The Dutch girls, as I said, were taken for questioning, and organizers were threatened with prosecution for a criminal offense. But what was interesting is that FIFA ended up negotiating with the Bavarian company and telling them that we will actually drop all charges if you promise not to infringe on the next World Cups. Yeah. So for the success of the World Cup, a collaborative effort, a collaborative enforcement, as we have seen, takes place. I gave an example of how international states, bilateral agreements help with that. States come in. The example of how UK shared their no-fly list, and there's also cooperation between national and regional and local police force, and the enforcement is done through 24-hour mobile courts. And so we see that the state plays a crucial role in enhancing private power. And the effects of this, there are some good effects and some bad effects. These are just a few examples. The effect of FIFA's governance is that it led to the production of spaces that are secure from physical and commercial security threats because of the intense policing. Some argue that it also enhanced the citizens' faith in South Africa's ability to secure its territory. Because before that, South Africa was known as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. In fact, in 2008, an interview showed that South Africa was top 3 most insecure countries, ahead of Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. So for the World Cup, the government sought to debunk that negative image. And also, people talk about nation building. For the World Cup, at least temporarily, there was, they brought people together. I remember watching the first goal scored by the South African team, and you could see black and white people instinctively hugging, which never happens because they rarely share the same spaces. And you could see them hugging, then getting shocked, then hugging again, you know. So that was one of the positive things that came out of that. In fact, you had some of the parents pledging that they are going to take their children to soccer because they had no idea that soccer was fun. This to them was a black game. And all of a sudden, they were seeing visitors from European countries enjoying the game. You know, so it made them rethink about football. And the bad effects is that, yes, security is delivered, but at what expense? Because for the World Cup, so what people did not see is that prior to the World Cup, people were taken away. Poor people were taken away to very far areas where they could not easily come to the city to be seen. Some theorize that as the criminalization of poverty. And even though one policeman refuted that, he said, well, these were laws that existed anyway. People are not allowed to be drunk or look messy, you know. And we were giving them some place to go. But people question the timing of that. Why wait just before the World Cup to do that? And also one of the bad effects is for example, the building of stadiums that cannot be financially maintained. The Cape Town Stadium is very underutilized. As I explained, it's in a very white-dominated area, which is far from many of the townships. And remember that soccer in South Africa is predominantly a black game. People cannot even afford the transport to go there. And even if they did, this stadium was built for 65,000 people. How many people can afford to go to such games? So a large chunk of the taxpayers' money is used for private gains. And what is interesting here is that for the Brazil World Cup, Brazil ended up suing FIFA because they felt that most of the money they used was for public funds and only FIFA had anything to gain. FIFA's response was that everything was stated in the contracts. So this is not a surprise. But what is also interesting is that, I don't know if you are following, but I did mention that the state is expected to indemnify FIFA for any loss. So when Brazil sues South Africa, when Brazil sues FIFA for the costs of using public funds for private gain, and yet it's expected through the agreements to be the one to indemnify FIFA. I don't understand whether that's just window dressing to show the public that they too are outraged. But it also attests to the fact that sometimes these governments get very excited and do not read these agreements thoroughly to understand what they entail. One particular person I interviewed mentioned, "I say this with the utmost respect, but I do not know if these documents were read. I feel like we signed a deal with the devil." So that is a very poignant statement when someone in the States says that they don't think that these documents were signed. But in all fairness, these documents are expected to be signed prior to even be considered for the running. And many of the governments are competing with other states, you know. Like, you're not the only one. If you don't want to sign, there'll always be Russia, there's always Qatar, there's always someone else willing to host this. So what people think is, let's sign, we'll deal with that later. As Desmond Tutu, one particular dominant political figure, said, we must host the World Cup. It's Africa's time. So what if we remain with white elephants? Who cares? Yeah. So what FIFA's governance teaches us, at least me, is that it reframes our normative thinking about governance. Who is governing on the ground, and what the effects are? How should we think about that? In particularly policing, when you have a private actor influencing how police should be done, at whose expense is this done, and who is excluded from the public good of security? For example, while those mega event spaces were safe, it turned out later that in the townships, because they were spread so thin, murders continued, rapes continued, and one policeman said, why did you think they would stop? Because FIFA is holding the World Cup, people should stop raping? So yes, these spaces are secure, but for a global elite and for the protection of commercial interests, but at the expense of other areas, as an example of South Africa. So also what FIFA shows us is that particularly in contemporary society, governance is characterized by collaborative interactions with state and non-state at different national levels. And it also raises questions on how to hold non-state actors accountable when they exist in a legal vacuum. As I explained, FIFA is a non-profit organization. It does not pay tax, but most importantly, if you sue it, it must be indemnified by the state. So it appears that it does not incur any losses. But from a governance point of view, I think another important question is, how do we harness the capacities of non-state actors for the public good in a capitalistic economy? For example, FIFA is a good governor in the sense that it is able to achieve its objectives every single time by coordinating and collaborating with others. But it does this at the detriment of the public. So the question is, how do we learn from FIFA so that we can harness and organize society for the public good? Thank you.